Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, the latest WoTA webinar, wherever you're dialing in from the world. Thank you for joining us. It's 11 o'clock here in the UK, a lovely spring, early summer day, and we look forward to having you with us for the next sort of 45 to 50 minutes. This is a very special webinar, one for members only, because we are discussing a very important topic and one which affects all of us in every country, and that is tax. But first, let me introduce myself. My name's Susanna Gill. I am Communications and Corporate Affairs Director at the UK Tote Group. I've been here at the Tote since 2018, since we acquired the business then in 2019. I've been working on improving it and working with partners and all the important projects that we've been doing with partners in the UK and internationally. Before that, I worked for Arena Racing Company in the UK and Betfair, and started my career in Westminster in politics. And in my spare time, I enjoy running, but I won't bore you with that. And much more importantly, before we get on to the topic of the day, let me introduce our guest speaker, who we're delighted to have with us because he is an absolute expert and the author of the report that we will be discussing. This is, of course, Martin Purbrick, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. He is chair of the Council for the Anti-Illegal Betting and Related Financial Crime, the ARF Council, a think tank established by the Asian Racing Federation, which comprises of 28 national racing authorities and racing-related organisations in Asia, Africa, Middle East. The ARF Council was established in 2017 and now comprises of 24 members from organisations engaged in horse racing and sports integrity, law enforcement, the UN, ODC, and academia generally. Martin is also an independent writer and researcher consulting on projects relating to a wide variety of areas, including transnational organised crime, financial crime, illegal betting, and the impact of betting on horse racing and sports integrity. From 2009 to 2020, he was Director of Security and Integrity at the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Martin reported directly to the CEO, and he was responsible for the department of 240 people conducting investigations in organised crime and corruption, and corruption threatening the Jockey Club, horse racing integrity more generally, anti-bribery and corruption prevention, anti-money laundering and financial risk management, illegal betting, threat research, customer due diligence, physical security, and emergency planning. So I think we can agree he knows what he's talking about. And before that, Martin was Director of Security and Travel Safety for McKinsey & Company, where he established and led global security function, reporting to the Office of General Counsel in New York. And prior to McKinsey, he worked for the Hong Kong Jockey Club as an executive manager. So had a stint with Asia Investigations Manager, with Intel Corporation, working against illegally sold computer processors and combating theft in integral products in the Asia region. So, and before the private sector, Martin joined the Royal Hong Kong Police Force in 1988 and spent 7 years as a detective sergeant inspector in Special Branch, the Criminal Intelligence Bureau and Communal Crime Bureau, dealing mainly with intelligence-led investigations in collaboration from overseas agencies. So generally, if you're one of the bad guys in the world, you probably don't want Martin on your case. But we're very lucky to have him on our team, helping us with our work at WoTA. So just for context, before we get into the detail of what we're going to discuss, the WoTA team and board members particularly have been working with Martin over the last few months on an important piece of work to highlight the role tote operators have in supporting horse racing and the positive contribution that we make to society, and the role that tax particularly has to play in that. This has led to a detailed report that Martin has authored for us, with the current working title is Tote Betting and Horse Racing, Tax, Responsible Gambling and Contribution to Society. Don't worry about taking lots of notes on this, because we are going to share documents after this call. But what we wanted to do over the next 45 minutes was to introduce the themes of the report to you, which Martin is going to do after I finish this introduction, and then have some Q&A between Martin and I on some of the key themes in that report, and also leave time to have questions from everyone here who's joined us for the webinar. So really, there's sort of three sections. There's the intro here, Martin talking about the report, and then us discussing it. But really do want some feedback from everyone here, because this report is in draft form. We haven't finalised it yet. We want to know what members think of it, both the content in terms of what's written in it, but also how you want the report to look as we finalise it, and how we disseminate it best for the most effective use for members around the world. And I will come on to that at the end as to what the final stages are in finalising the report. But at this stage, if you want to use your Q&A button, which is at the bottom of the screen, there should be a question mark and a Q&A. Put in any questions there, and then I can see them, and so can our able team at WoTA who are behind the scenes, and we will make sure those questions are asked once Martin has concluded his presentation and we've discussed a few of the big themes. We'll have time for questions. Equally, afterwards, Florence will circulate the report and notes from this webinar. So if you suddenly think of something you want to ask afterwards, that's absolutely fine as well. You won't have missed the boat. So with that opening gambit from me, I think it's time to hand over to Martin, who is going to run through what he's written, the main themes, and really just take us through what the report is going to try and illustrate about pool betting and the role that WoTA members in particular are playing around the world. So Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Susanna. With that very lengthy background introduction, you've given away my age, I think. And my children always find it quite amusing to say that I was a police officer in the last century, which does make it sound a very long time ago. And obviously, we're not talking about criminality or criminal justice or any issues like that, but really business risk today. I think that's the whole purpose of this report, and how the activities of WoTA members can mitigate that risk and obviously improve their business performance. So I'm really grateful to you, Susanna, and to Harold and Florence at the WoTA Secretariat for guiding us through that in this report. And thank you very much for everyone for attending. I know it's very difficult to think about a new report like this when you don't actually have the report in front of you. So so what we'll do today, if you don't mind, is firstly give you a sight of some slides, and I'll just put that up now. Bear with me. How's that, Susanna? Is the display okay? Great. Okay.
Yeah.
So that you don't have the report in front of you, but I'll take you through the executive summary, basically, of the report and the key points, to get some feedback, to ask questions of you. I think we really would value some insight into whether you think these key points from the executive summary are the right ones, if we're going in the right direction, and if we're reflecting the key issues that that WoTA should be representing on behalf of its members to just stakeholders. And those stakeholders are quite wide. Government, starting at the top, really, government policymakers, gambling regulators, other betting operators, racing itself as a sport, and a very complex sport, as you all know. So there's a wide range of stakeholders who we do need to influence, and even those outside of this sector who are critical of betting and gambling as activities because of the social implications. And indeed are critical increasingly of horse racing. So it is a complex set of stakeholders to navigate in the future. And this report seeks to help WoTA members do that by touching on key points that in the future can be useful for influencing in a positive way. So the purpose of doing this, of producing the report and the research, really is to put together a whole range of issues and narratives and more positively reflect them from WoTA, eventually in the public domain. I mean, this isn't just a report for WoTA members, it's a report to be put in the public domain and influence stakeholders in due course. So there's a bit of work to be done to do that. And perhaps if I could just give you, firstly, apologies for the density of text and bullet points on the slides as we go through. Again, I think that shows my age more than anything. It isn't very visual, but as you don't have the report, I hope you can have a little bit more to read today. On the left here, you can see the guidance from the WoTA board for this report at the start when we started the research and the writing. I'll just go through that. Clearly explain the necessity for differentiation of tax on betting on horse racing from other online gambling types. And I think that's been a key part of this report. Why is tax on tote betting usually or largely at the same level or a comparable level as other forms of gambling that are far, far, far more negative in terms of harm, social impact and risk? Tote betting, I think we'd all agree, is far less harmful, far less risk, and there are academics reflecting this as well. Yet tax levels, which are usually intended by governments to mitigate the social impact of gambling, are at the same level. And this is clearly unfair and clearly illogical. So this is something we need to address in a rational way. Secondly, why parimutuel betting operators are an integral and necessary part of the horse racing ecosystem. I think you all know this because of what you do in collaboration with racing as a sport, racing operators, the racing federations, racing authorities. These are key stakeholders and partners, but probably others in society don't understand this complex, mutually beneficial relationship. Horse racing clearly does need parimutuel betting. I say that in comparison to fixed odds betting. I think parimutuel betting is critical to horse racing, and we can go into that later. And the sustainability of horse racing. Thirdly, clearly explain what the optimum tax level for betting on horse racing should be. That's a little bit different. I think the feedback we got from some WoTA members in the discussions of the report was there's not necessarily an optimal tax level, because tax levels on betting vary considerably around the world. But there's certainly a range, and there is certainly an upper point above which the sustainability of betting may be in jeopardy. And I think that's something that needs to be reflected to government policymakers. Clearly explain why an optimal level of tax on parimutuel betting is critical to ensure that illegal markets do not undermine legal markets. And this is something I think we have to better explain to government policymakers and gambling regulators, that illegal markets, and I use that phrase from the work we do with the Asian Racing Federation, International Federation of Horse Racing Authorities, and coming from the Hong Kong Jockey Club, illegal betting is a growing problem, and it is salami slicing away at legal betting markets, which means the revenue of legal betting operators, including tote operators. And that has a consequent financial impact on everyone involved in this ecosystem of tote betting and horse racing. And then lastly, from the WoTA board, any other members that the board and WoTA members think should be included in this. So that's rather a lot. And when you do get the report eventually, it's rather a long report, I'm afraid. It's about 14,000 words. But the key points you can see broken down on the right. And I'd say there are really three areas: totes and tax, totes and contribution to racing, totes and gambling harm. And there's substantial discussion and commentary of these to reflect a positive view of tote betting. So these are the key areas from the executive summary, and I'll go through these one by one on the following slides. I won't go through it here. That's a little bit dense. But firstly, tote betting on horse racing is very different from other forms of gambling. Well, I think you'd all know that and say that coming from tote operators. Many people don't understand that differentiation, and I do think it needs to be better explained to government policymakers. I was particularly interested in probably what Susanna saw as well, some of the debates in the United Kingdom in the past few months of politicians having a hearing on the proposals from the Gambling Commission to impose new regulations, for example, relating to affordability checks on betting and gambling. And it struck me, looking at this parliamentary hearing, there's a very, very limited level of knowledge amongst politicians and policymakers, the professional policymakers to some extent, on what is this sector. It's clearly a very, very complex sector with a very, very complex set of games. And those games range from games of pure chance, where consumers may be, repeatedly pressing a button on a screen or on a device, and then an algorithm determines the outcome. So that is not a game of skill. That's a game of pure chance. And one of the things that we've tried for some years to certainly say from the racing federations and Hong Kong Jockey Club is we must differentiate betting on horse racing as a game of skill and not a game of chance. And I think many stakeholders don't understand that. But clearly, betting on horse racing is far more complex than some of the repetitive chance-based games that rely on simply the algorithm of an operator. And we do have to reflect that. This is a game of skill, and because of that, it's far less risk to consumers as well. So obviously the problem in the second bullet point on the left, there are frequently equal levels of tax on high risk products and lower risk products. So these high risk online casino games, clearly we would contend to policymakers and gambling regulators that they do potentially have far higher impact on society, higher levels of gambling harm. And that is reflected by academic studies. So the report goes into detail with a variety of references to academic studies. And I just mentioned one here from Stockholm. Interactive internet gambling, electronic game machines, casino gambling, high stakes unregulated legal gambling are often relatively harmful forms of gambling. Instant lotteries and ordinary lotteries generally appear relatively harmless. Other forms of gambling, sports pools, bingo, horse betting, typically constitute an intermediate category. So this is a conclusion that's widely accepted by a wide range of academics, that there is far higher risk from some of the interactive immediacy of games rather than some of the games involving thinking about the product and thinking about the outcome of a race or a sport. So secondly, we would contend, and we do in the report, that tote betting is inherently safer for consumers. And this is a complex area because we'd be getting into debates with academics, and we do need to hold our own on this and persuade them why this is the case. We would contend that unlike bookmakers, profits from tote operators are calculated completely differently, obviously. So I particularly like looking at the Hong Kong Jockey Club totalizator screen because of the complexity of prices and price calculations that it displays. Obviously, with multiple bet types across that rather large board, and then the constant changing of figures. Many consumers don't have the time or don't wish to spend the time to engage in this game of skill. So it's clearly a very different game from the immediacy of other types of gambling and betting, in fact. But it's clearly also a very different type of operation from fixed odds bookmakers who make their profits, and apologies for those of you who operate fixed odds betting as well. It's not a criticism of the industry, it's just an observation, but largely make their profits from the customer losing. Whereas in a totalizator system, obviously the operator takes a cut, a takeout from the total amount wagered. And so we have to differentiate this and explain why it is very different in terms of betting, and why the impact on consumers is very different as well. Tote betting is slower. Again, Hong Kong racing is a very good example. It's similar to how racing is conducted around the world in most jurisdictions. A break between races, which gives customers time to look at the odds, look at the prices, look at the form, and that takes time. There is no immediacy in this. Obviously, races are rather short, but the lead up to a bet by a customer and a consumer is quite prolonged. And obviously, for many people, I think of my late father-in-law in Hong Kong, who many years ago would show me his bets on the Hong Kong Jockey Club. He would take the entire week to calculate his bets, and that shows the nature of some customers on tote betting. I think it's very different from the immediacy of other forms of betting. So what does it mean for racing itself as well? I think this question has been looked at on a national basis and on a regional basis, but it's not been well enough studied on a global basis. It's very clear that tote betting is fundamental to the economic structure of horse racing around the world. That's our top line conclusion from this. It's a sport and leisure activity, horse racing, that itself has a major positive economic impact. That is through the GDP contributions and also employment around the world. And I think it was interesting looking at studies conducted by others. For example, the Asian Racing Federation in Asia, WoTA in Europe in previous years, several national studies. BHA conducted a study a few years ago, and some sort of lighter studies, for example, one in South America. If you put all of these together, we're looking at horse racing as a sport being responsible for at least several million jobs around the world. And then the GDP contributions at a national level, at a regional level, are also huge, several $100 billion in gross domestic product. So I think we do need to better project this on a global basis, not just a national and a regional basis, to show the strength of tote betting contributions to horse racing, and also to help horse racing operators, authorities, and federations better understand that as well. So I think this message comes from WoTA to help that understanding. So what are the challenges at the moment facing tote operators? Well, we'd say tax is a structural problem in many countries. It's vastly varying around the world. And once you see the data in our report, which carries on from an Asian Racing Federation report that we produced about a year ago into tax on betting, but expands it a little further to include more jurisdictions. There are vastly different rates of betting on tote operators and other racing betting operators. There is no consistency in this. And I think that means there's no consistency in the understanding of the impact of the taxation level on tote betting. Obviously, tax will have a consequence on the takeout from tote betting that the operator needs to take to be able to sustain the business. And the contention that we made from the ARF some time ago, and we continue to make here from WoTA, is that the increasingly high takeout rate for totalizator operators will lead to reduced value being passed on to customers. That leads to more customers migrating to illegal betting markets. Obviously, prices are better there because operators don't have such a high takeout rate, and they don't pay any tax at all. I would, make sure we mention to government regulators. So there's a decrease in the legal betting product, decreased taxation, decreased contributions to the sport of horse racing, and an increase in consumers betting with the illegal market. And I think this reflects the research that we have coming from the Asian Racing Federation Council, which in the past decade has seen this trend in Asia. And I think increasingly it's a threat to betting operators in Europe and to some extent in the future in the Americas, although a very, very different market. But we do have to convince government policymakers and regulators that this narrative is accurate and is correct. Because as I said, there's a salami slicing away at the legal market that eventually will have an impact on tax contributions and contributions to racing as a sport. So what can we say to governments about the tax on tote betting? So I think it's useful to start with a Laffer curve. Sorry, I had to get a diagram in somewhere to sort of break down my dense bullet points, and at a Laffer curve, at least an attractive diagram. But there's some criticism of Laffer curves. Some people would say they only tell you two things. Firstly, that when tax is 0%, zero tax is collected. Secondly, when tax is 100%, zero tax is collected because no one will want to make any money, or no one can make any money. So there's some contention if the Laffer curve is correct, but it's generally accepted as a principle that as taxation increases, it does clearly have an impact on business. What we're saying in the report, it not only has an impact on business with a higher takeout rate, but it also has an impact on consumers, moving consumers to different markets, illegal market penetration of the legal market, etc. So I think this is something we need to persuade government policymakers that they need to look at tax levels, consider either an optimum rate or an optimum range that does not negatively affect the legal market and drive consumers to illegal markets. And I think that's something we can have success with if we put this in a credible way. So what's been happening in previous years, as I said, we studied this from the ARF for at least a decade. We would suggest through WoTA now, due to relatively high levels of tax, tote betting is prevented from competing effectively against online illegal betting operators, as well as offshore operators who pay no tax to governments and no financial contribution to horse racing. And that's the key point. No tax to government, no financial contribution to horse racing. So the tax rate does have to be optimal, and it has to be carefully considered. Obviously, tax is rather a politicized issue in every country, so it's difficult to persuade policymakers of this. And tax varies considerably, as I said, up to, I think probably the highest we'd observe is Hong Kong, where it can be as high as 75% of GGR. The lowest, possibly South Africa, 6% of GGR, although I believe Norway has, Harold can tell us later, has zero tax. I'm not sure that's necessarily a good idea. I think it's extremely important that betting operators show that they are responsible contributors to government and society. So taxation shouldn't be something that we seek to avoid. It should be something that's appropriately structured and contributes to a sustainable business. So there is a median rate if we look at all the jurisdictions across the world. I'm not sure if the median rate is something we would say is the right one. And I think typically we should be saying that the optimum level of tax will differ in every country. And that's because there are different social, economic, and cultural circumstances in every country. And the taxation level should be set appropriately for each one. There's probably no optimum global level, but we can look at different jurisdictions and learn from them of the impact of tax on legal and illegal markets. And with the illustration on the right, what are those illegal markets involved in terms of growth? There are increasingly a number of offshore jurisdictions, Curacao, Kanawaki, Malta, illustrated here, but a long list of more. The Philippines, for example, is a large one, where they claim to be giving licensed betting opportunities. And I would recommend that we have to contend that this is not legal licensed onshore betting. You as tote operators pay tax in your own jurisdiction. Offshore licensed betting operators do not. And that's the difference with these offshore licensing regimes. And I would recommend that in due course, WoTA seek to align with the racing federations on this so that there's a common narrative about the impact of offshore licensing regimes, because they don't pay any tax and they don't make a contribution to racing. So what we're contending in relation to tax is that more high-risk forms of gambling should be taxed at a higher rate than totes because of the greater prevalence of problem gambling. And we do show some evidence of that from academic studies that we've pulled in from around the world. Evidence is variable, and this is a difficult area we're getting in to engage with. And so I think some care is needed with the language and the narratives in the future. But there are enough strong academics and reputable academics who we can quote from, who clearly show the high risk of electronic gambling machines compared to betting on racing, betting on other sports, which is lower risk. So we have to be able to say that, but not in such a simplistic way. We have to provide evidence to back it up as well. So Susanna, I've flown through that. Perhaps if I can just go back up to this slide. Should I leave that on as a background? Would that be okay?
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you. Now we went through a few questions, but I actually have a few more on listening to what you were saying. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of big picture questions before we got into perhaps the details of the report. I mean, obviously you've got an extensive career looking at illegal activity, particularly in the business world. And you talked about the limited level of knowledge that policymakers have related to gambling particularly, but have you found that in all the other areas of business related work you've done? And how have you addressed that? I mean, it's particularly relevant when we have a general election going on here in the UK. So levels of political knowledge is being discussed every day in our country, but at the moment. But I just thought, for context of what we're trying to deal with in terms of educating policymakers, this is not the first time we're not the first sector to have to do this. But I just wanted your experience of it over the last few years.
Exactly, and I think now being based in the UK has been quite instructive in seeing the debate here. Having come from Asia, where I spent 32 years, and seeing how that debate takes place there. And perhaps I can use those two examples as comparisons. So in Hong Kong, there's somewhat of a puritanical attitude towards gambling, and if you step back, that's often driven by religious sensitivities in different jurisdictions and cultures, and there really is a very strong Christian sensitivity in Hong Kong towards gambling, and the government there is very sensitive about that. So it seeks to enable a sufficient level of legal licensed betting and gambling that enables the legal market to exist effectively and not be subsumed by the illegal market. Because it's such a politicized issue, that doesn't necessarily work, because I think it typically means in a jurisdiction like that, the government has too many restrictions on legal betting. And obviously, as you know, being operators need to move somewhat quickly in terms of product and price. The more restrictions there are on product and price, the less quickly you can move to show value to consumers, who will go elsewhere if they don't find that value. So there's a clear problem in Hong Kong that I'm sure my ex-colleagues from Hong Kong Jockey Club who are on this call would recognize as well, that they have some shackles from government in regulation that makes it difficult because of those sensitivities. And then if you look at the UK, well, you know it better than me, Susanna. There seems to be a love-hate relationship with betting and gambling. Certainly, the UK liberalised the system quite early, so that gambling operators had less restrictions than many other jurisdictions. But at the same time, there's a creeping regulation that is, as I mentioned earlier, having some impact on responsible licensed operators. And that's the problem. I think despite the pressure, political pressure for increased regulation, which policymakers and politicians and regulators have to follow, they have to be sensitive to those political pressures. They clearly also need to better differentiate between legal and illegal markets and responsible and irresponsible operators. And obviously we contend that tote operators are the most responsible operators. And that's something we put in this report, that the responsible gambling policies from tote operators are likely to be far more comprehensive and impactful than from many other operators. So I think there are difficulties in every jurisdiction. And some of our friends from mainland European countries will say the thing that there's an increasing problem of the tightness of regulation that affects the legal licensed operators, but consumers are then driven elsewhere, and that's the problem. Driven offshore, driven to illegal markets. And I think we need to better educate gambling regulators about this.
Yeah, I agree. And it's not about pitching tote operators against legal fixed odds operators, but there has to be a way somehow of making sure we look after the activity of WoTA members, because it's so important to horse racing. So it's not a case of saying that we don't like fixed odds, but it is a case of promoting ourselves and all the good things we do, particularly here in the UK, where we are a fixed odds dominated market, and that's how we'll always be. But it doesn't mean there isn't a really important role for pool betting that we can play. And obviously in Asia, it is entirely pool betting. Thank you. That was very interesting. That was to say just a question I thought of. Having read out your biog and heard the feedback on the report, and something else that we discussed, which is in context of the excellent feedback we've had from members on this report, which has enabled Martin to do the first draft. So thank you to everyone who fed back. And again, if you're listening to this and you think there are nuggets of information that could be helpful from your territory, do keep the feedback coming in when you look at the documents after this webinar, because that would be really helpful. But thank you to everyone who's fed in so far. And I guess, Martin, I was going to ask you, is there anything in all of the material you read and the 14,000 words that you've put together, is there anything that's taken you by surprise that you weren't expecting, given you are somewhat of an expert in this subject? But yeah, anything that surprised you?
Well, I do hope I'm not projected as an expert on tax. Let's say that. Although I keep writing about tax, but the tax part is not surprising, but I think is worth dwelling on from a business perspective. And when our colleagues see this report, and you can look back at the ARF report on tax as well, the sheer variety of taxation levels is quite troubling. And obviously, many WoTA members don't operate in one jurisdiction; they operate in many jurisdictions. So having to balance different taxation levels in different jurisdictions, different take-out rates is quite complex. That's not necessarily surprising, but I think it's a key thing to address for the industry itself. What did surprise me most was the levels of contribution that tote betting especially makes to horse racing. I'd never looked at that on a global basis, so it was only when I started to pull together a few reports and look at work done previously by the Asian Racing Federation, by the BHA, by WoTA. WoTA worked with McKinsey, I think about 12 years ago, to produce a report that has some very good data. And one point from that WoTA and McKinsey research that I just highlight is that, and I'll quote this, despite having 43% of betting stakes on racing, tote operators contributed 84% of direct betting funding for horse racing. Now, that was a WoTA study a few years ago, and I think that sort of data could be updated. It's the sort of thing we can continue to study going forward. But it clearly shows that tote operators have an imbalanced contribution to racing, that other betting operators are not contributing enough. And that's important. It's because there's pressure on tote operators with a reduction of revenue because of offshore competition, illegal betting competition. But the scale of contribution from tote betting is huge. As I mentioned earlier, over 2 million people employed in racing around the world, these huge contributions to GDP from racing, but tote operators contributing a very large proportion of that, over 80% of it historically. And I think that's something we need to better educate policymakers and racing as well, racing stakeholders, so that they can argue for this preferential role for tote operators with racing.
Yeah, and I know obviously we're talking about tax and putting things in very financial terms, but there's a huge cultural impact that comes with the financial support of horse racing and equine activities around the world as well. That it's not quite quantifiable in that way. If you lost the tote from racecourses here in the UK, you'd lose a huge part of the atmosphere of racecourses, as you would if you had, you lost the bookies on the rails. So every country has such a cultural footprint for horse racing.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, I was going to ask the next question we don't want to put anyone in lights or depress anyone, but I was going to ask you sort of which if you were looking at the best models of countries that stood out as the most positive or the most challenging, were there any that particularly stood out to you? I mean, we're all different, but yeah, any that stood out to you particularly?
Politically, I should say Hong Kong, or my former boss will kill me. And he's a very influential chap. So, but no, there's a lot to learn from every jurisdiction, obviously. And there's no perfect country because operators in all countries have different challenges. Said, I think I'd look at it from a social, cultural, political, and an economic perspective, and that's different in all countries. Probably somewhat more homogenous in Europe. Mainland Europe, that is, because of some homogeneity in regulation across Europe, but obviously difficulties for tote operators in each country because gambling is still regulated separately across the European Union. So maybe I'd highlight a couple of positives because I think there are many positives from many countries, and there's no single best jurisdiction. So the UK has a relatively open market. I think I'd worry about the constrictions that seem to be taking place from the Gambling Commission's most recent changes. The UK Tote obviously makes a really strong contribution, pays the betting levy, which is I think 10% at the moment, if that's right, of gross profit. And I think from the BHA, we looked at each jurisdiction, and the BHA has paid an additional 50 million over 7 years to race courses themselves. So that's a pretty strong contribution, and it shows the value of that. But the levy system is also extremely strong in Europe. The PMU in France, I think, is a very good example, which directly supports the French horse racing industry. Very strong data on that from the PMU. 660,000 direct and indirect jobs throughout France in horse racing. And in 2023, the PMU paid a total of 835 million euros to France Galop and La Trotte. So the model itself, if it's sustainable, is extremely strong. Clearly, that contribution to racing as a sport, to the cultural aspects of equine culture that you also mentioned, is necessary. I think the challenge is persuading policymakers that without that support, there would be problems. The other examples I'd highlight from Asia are maybe Hong Kong and Japan, and Hong Kong first. So I mentioned Hong Kong has probably the highest tax rate on betting in the world, up to 75% of GGR, but it still manages through this very high cost model and operating racing, as most of you know from being engaged with racing, it's extremely capital intensive and high cost. It still manages to produce an exceptional model, and that is challenging. But the other jurisdiction I'd highlight from Asia is Japan. I think lesser known perhaps because Japan's a somewhat more culturally distinct society, but I hope we can understand more about their racing in Sapporo at the Asian Racing Conference. But the Japanese Racing Association provides 10% of gross betting turnover to the national treasury and 50% of surplus profits in addition. So it also is the major operator of racing and a major funder of racing, as well as other equine and agricultural aspects of equine culture. So I think there's something to learn from jurisdictions around the world. They're all very different. That's the key point. But there's no perfect one, but there's a great deal that we should be learned from exchanging from each other.
Quite. I think we're sometimes guilty of thinking everyone else does it better, and actually there's no country that's got it quite right, which is why the work we're doing at WoTA is so important. And thank you. The questions are coming in, so that's brilliant. I'm going to read the first one from Paul Cross, who has asked a very relevant one. Talking of illegal operators paying no tax, how do we stop the major illegal operator in Asia from betting on racing?
Yeah,
be there.
And I'll put my other hat on, the ARF Council. I don't think we stop them. I think this will be a sustained competition that we need more help from governments to ensure that legal licensed betting operators, and especially tote operators, have sufficient flexibility on price and product. And that means taxation, obviously, so that takeout rates aren't too high. And consumers can be attracted to stay with legal operators. Obviously, that depends on your own market. That means retaining consumers in your own market. In Asia, there are markets where there is no sufficient legal betting, so there are massive amounts of consumers who will fuel that illegal betting market in Asia, particularly from China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand to some extent, India, where betting is still quite restricted. So those markets will continue to fuel illegal betting operators. So those operators will continue to have an impact on the rest of the world as well. But I think the key thing is that operators need to have a sufficiently robust competitive policy to prevent customer leakage away to those illegal markets. And that does depend on price and product, and not being overly constrained by regulators on price and product. Should we go on to James?
Apologies, sorry, I got stuck on mute. I've got another excellent bit of feedback from James Porteous and the Hong Kong Jockey Club. And this is a very relevant point because it's something we've already discussed as a group. But he's just suggested perhaps the title of the gambling harm section should be rephrased to talk about being safer for consumers as opposed to use of the word harm. And in fact, one of the things we've been debating is whether we talk about gambling harm or problem gambling and phrases like that. So when we circulate this report, feedback on the language that's used and how that would be interpreted in your jurisdiction would be really helpful, because we want to use terms that are best recognized internationally and in a positive way. So we don't want to use any phrases that that cause any issues in your jurisdiction. So that's really helpful feedback from James, and I think something we can go through again. I'm conscious of time because we've hit the sort of 45 minutes. So if anyone wants to put any other questions in, please put them in now. And I'm just going to give you a bit of a summary on what the next steps are, because I think that's really important. So obviously we've taken you through the report as it stands at the moment and the big themes that Martin has spent time researching and writing about. After this report, Florence, the WoTA General Secretary, will circulate a link to this webinar. This will be on the members area of the website, a link to this webinar, also the slides that Martin's talked about and the report as it currently stands. From there, we'd really welcome feedback to go back to Florence on the report, particularly obviously I say that the language used, if there's anything that you think doesn't read right or should be phrased differently, or any ideas of information that isn't in there. If any WoTA members have information from their jurisdiction which they think would be a helpful addition, please send it and share it. If everyone could do that by Friday the 14th of June, that would be very helpful, because the board will then discuss the report the following Friday, when a few people are here for Royal Ascot here in the UK, and a few dialing in as well. And then after that, the report will be finalised in terms of how it looks. And it sounds a bit shallow, but of course, having a nice front cover and making sure it looks good is as important as all the words that are in it, to make sure it's engaging for policymakers. And again, at that point, we could look at also translating perhaps particularly the executive summary into different languages, if that would be useful. So please include that in your feedback if you think in your territory having a version in the native language would be helpful rather than just English. So we're open to ideas, with the idea of the report being finalised at some point in July for dissemination after that, which will be an ongoing process. Obviously, we'll try and create an event around launching it, but also it will be there as a resource for all members to use in the coming months and years, because the debates we're having and the themes Martin's talked about aren't going away. So that's where we are with next steps. Today, Florence will circulate that on email sort of later this week when we have the slides, the final report and the recording of this webinar. And I guess just to give anyone a final chance on any questions coming in, I was just going to say, Martin, if you could look into your crystal ball, where would you see things going with this sector? And obviously we hope this report has a positive impact and moves things in the right way, but where do you see governments, be it in Asia or other places around the world, taking gambling policy in the next 5 to 10 years? Are you positive about it?
Well, that might be the next report for WoTA or possibly the racing federations. We'll see, but and it's quite a big question. I mean, obviously the influence of the legalization of sports betting in the US is changing betting markets around the world. It's changed them in the US completely, obviously. What will gambling regulators learn from that, I think, is a key question, because there is a risk to us from the operator perspective that regulators see the growth of the legal market as fueling the growth of consumer gambling. But so we do have to continue to persuade regulators that that the growth of the legal market is a positive thing, and if we don't enable that, then illegal markets will frankly take over, which has happened in some markets, especially Asia. So what will happen? That means price, product, has to continue to improve and communicate that appropriately. So ideally, in 5 years' time, we might have some greater harmonization of tax on tote betting. I think that's extremely important, especially as Whirlpool grows, but that's going to be quite difficult. I mean, harmonizing tax across jurisdictions in any product is difficult. So I think Whirlpool is clearly the showcase for all of this, to show that there's this great sport, there's this great series of events, and there's highly responsible betting on an international basis through the most responsible betting operators, which are the tote operators. And that's a showcase product and sport to show policymakers and regulators of how this development of legal responsible betting can take place.
Well, I think that's a very positive note to end on, and hopefully what the work we're doing here will contribute to that. So thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who's dialed on. We had a really good turnout, and obviously more people will listen to this when Florence circulates the recording. Please share your feedback. Take the time to read the report. I can vouch for how well written it is, but we say welcome feedback. We want to make sure this is as useful report as it possibly can be for all WoTA members, and something we can lean on and use for the next year or two as the conversation progresses. And I know people meet in Japan for the next Asian Racing Federation conference, etc. So lots of chances to make use of it, but it's only as good as all of the work we put into it. So keep that feedback coming. Florence will circulate next steps on email. And otherwise, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. Absolutely invaluable. And we look forward to continuing to work with you. Right. People later in the year, hopefully on a race course somewhere. So thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.